Hi, I'm Lionel Windsor, a New Testament lecturer at Moore College in Sydney. This is the seventh of a series of videos where I'm explaining what obedience and submission mean in a book of the Bible called 1 Peter. I've recently written a scholarly article about it in a journal called the Global Anglican. I thought it would be helpful to make my research a bit more accessible for everybody, so that's what these videos are all about. In this video, we're looking at a particular form of submission in church relationships, submitting to church leaders. It's important for Christians to come to grips with this for two reasons. Firstly, so that we understand why ordered church relationships matter. And secondly, so we know what submission in church actually means and what it doesn't mean, so that we don't go too far in the wrong direction. Now, in previous videos, we looked in detail at the word submit. We looked at how the word was used generally in ancient Greek, and also how Peter himself uses the word. We saw that the word for submission itself doesn't mean following specific orders, despite what many modern people often assume when they hear the word. Instead, Peter is talking here about voluntarily placing yourself in various ordered human relationships. Now, when it comes to submission in church, we can easily make a false step. We can come to this passage assuming we know exactly what submission means, and then impose our own meaning on the Bible. But we need to be very careful here. As we've seen in the videos so far, submission in 1 Peter involves voluntarily placing yourself in various ordered human relationships. And this will look different depending on the particular ordered relationship involved. In the ancient Greek world, the word submit was used of many different kinds of ordered relationships. They included creational orders, political orders, military orders, economic orders, marriage, and these various ordered arrangements were different. So they all normally involved something we might call authority, but the particular kind of authority involved always needs to be understood in relation to the particular kind of order involved. So the word submit, for example, in the ancient world can mean things like people submitting to a political order, or believers actively trusting in God's rule instead of complaining, or children submitting to parents, or a person in authority yielding to their subjects' rightful claim. They're different kinds of orders, different kinds of authority. Creational authority is not the same as political authority. They're different in turn from economic authority. And the kind of order in marriage, especially as the Bible talks about it, primarily involves honour and integrity rather than rule or control. So the first question we need to ask here is, what is the nature of the order and authority that elders have when it comes to church? To understand that, we need to go back a few verses and see how Peter describes the authority of elders, and also how he limits their authority as well. He's just said for younger ones to submit to elders. So what does he mean by the authority of elders? So he says, "So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that's among you, exercising oversight, not domineering over those in your charge, but being models to the flock." The most important thing that Peter says here is that the nature of the elders' leadership has to be understood in relation to Christ. More precisely, Peter refers back to the sufferings of Christ. Peter's already spelled this out in chapter 2. He says, "To this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." Christ's suffering acts as an example for all Christians. Specifically, it acts as an example for church leaders. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. So here, Jesus' suffering wasn't random. It was a sacrifice for us. He took our sins on himself and brought us life. He gave himself for us. At the same time, he gave us an example to live by. So notice how Jesus' sacrificial giving is directly connected to Jesus' authority. They're not two different things. They're linked very closely together. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Notice how Jesus is described. He is the example, and he is the shepherd and the overseer. Okay, so now look at how church leadership is described. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not domineering over those in your charge, but being models to the flock. It's just like that of Christ. Leaders are to be shepherds, like Christ was a loving and sacrificial shepherd. They are to be overseers, like Christ was a loving and sacrificial shepherd and overseer. And they are to follow Christ's example and so be models to others. What are they models of? Models of love and sacrifice and self-giving. And also, this is really important, the nature of church authority is explicitly and clearly different to the regular world's view of authority. It's not to be domineering, and that's directly connected to Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, where Jesus says, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles domineer over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. So what can we say about the nature of the order and authority of church leaders? It follows Christ's example, and the actual authority and the order consists in being a model to others like Christ. It's primarily about love and sacrifice and self-giving. And just in case you're tempted to say, oh yes, but it also must have to do with the kind of leadership authority that we see in the world, it's specifically not like the kind of domineering authority found in the world. So that's the order we're talking about. That's the particular authority we're talking about. The authority of love, sacrifice, self-giving, and example. So what does it mean then when Peter says to submit to the elders? Well, submission always needs to be understood in light of the order and authority involved, the order and authority that Peter has just described. The primary way to submit to these leaders is to listen to them as they share a bit of the truth about Jesus and to follow their example of love and sacrifice and self-giving. Now, we might feel the need to import other elements of authority and order, elements that Peter doesn't specifically mention. We might be tempted to add those to the idea of submission here. Some people in the early church, like Clement and Ignatius, imported military ideas into their ideas of church order and authority and submission. They talked about Christians submitting to church leaders like soldiers obey their commanders. In the modern church, we can do something similar, but from a different model. We can import modern business ideas into our ideas of church order and authority and submission. We can talk about Christians submitting to church leaders like employees submit to bosses. We can talk about business plans and things like that. Now, those things aren't necessarily wrong to do, and yes, it's right to have discipline in church. We see that in places like Matthew and 1 Timothy. And yes, it's very helpful to have clear structures for decision-making and knowing who's who, etc. But we also need to be very, very careful here, don't we? Because Jesus and Peter specifically rule out the kind of domineering church order and authority and submission that's imported from the world. So we need to be very careful about using the word submit in military or political or business terms. And we need to be especially careful when church leaders insist on us submitting to them by importing military or political or business terms, as if that's what the Bible's talking about here. We need to be careful in those areas that go beyond listening to the gospel about Jesus and following their example of love, sacrifice, and self-giving. Yes, ideas from the business world can be helpful, but when they're used in this spiritual way, they can also too easily end up being abusive. Okay, the next video is the final one. And in the last video, I'll draw together and summarise all the things I've been saying about obedience and submission in 1 Peter. I'll see you in that next and last video then.